Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm thrilled that you've joined the Systems Change Lab for this conversation on 3 breakthroughs to transform climate finance. My name is Paul Bodner, and I'm the Director for Sustainable Finance, Industry, and Diplomacy at the Bezos Earth Fund, which is happy to host today's discussion in partnership with World Resources Institute's Finance Center. This is the third installment in a series of webinars by the Systems Change Lab that focus on system transformations by sector. And today we'll be talking about finance, the lifeblood of the global economy. We're at a very interesting point in the story for those who've been following this for a while on the role of finance in helping to drive and enable decarbonization in the global economy. We've got an unprecedented number of actors really focused on net zero and how we're going to get there, not just governments anymore, but banks, asset managers, asset owners, actors across the financial system, many of whom have been mobilized into the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ. We've got corporations from every sector trying to figure out how they're going to contribute to net zero and trying to find each other up and down value chains. We've, of course, got civil society. We have cities, we have regions. So more people than ever are focused on this question of how we're going to achieve systems change, including in the financial system. And yet, of course, we have a system that is moving too slowly. We're dealing with the largest intentional makeover of the global economy ever attempted. And of course, that is difficult to do quickly when it comes to emissions, because the assets in the economy that cause emissions are, generally speaking, long life assets: power plants, cement plants, steel mills, container ships, planes. These are not, it's not the work of a moment to get these turned over into versions of those assets that don't emit carbon, but provide the services we want in the global economy. So that's the challenge we're faced with. And the moment we find ourselves in, more actors than ever wanting to contribute, more tools than ever available, more finance available than ever, and yet a sticky global economy that's hard to change. And we're gathering today here at a moment, a very interesting moment with an exceptional panel, which I'll introduce in a moment. We are just about a week away from a summit for a new Global Financial Pact that President Macron is hosting in Paris. We're at a critical moment of discussions around the reform of international financial institutions, coal phase out in emerging markets, and many other topics that we're going to delve into here today. So before we get into the panel, I'm going to first introduce Moazzam Malik, the Managing Director for Global Delivery at WRI, who will set the groundwork for today's discussion with opening remarks on systems change and the finance sector. And then after that, we're going to turn to a panel discussion with Avinash Persaud, Special Envoy to the Prime Minister of Barbados on investment and financial services and for climate finance. I hope that fits on a business card, Avi. Catherine McKenna, Chair of the UN Expert Group on Net Zero Pledges of Business, Financial Institutions, Cities and Regions, another great business card thing, and of course, former minister in the Canadian government, and Rachel Kite, Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University. And I'll give them a more fulsome introduction in a little bit, but for now, I will turn it over to Moazzam. Thanks.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for having me, Paul. It's really a pleasure to be in this session. And I'm really looking forward to the panel with this very, very exciting group of people that we've managed to line up today. I wanted to start by saying just a little bit about Systems Change Lab. So to limit global temperature rise, halt biodiversity loss, and build a fairer economy, nearly every major system will need to transform. This means looking at how we power our economies, grow food, build cities, conserve nature, and beyond. And if we're to create a sustainable and just future, we must navigate these challenges with a systems lens. So the Systems Change Lab was created in response to the urgent need for these transformational changes. We've identified more than 70 critical shifts across these major systems, ranging from the need to phase out unabated coal and fossil fuels, extending financial services to poor communities, adopting holistic indicators for economic well-being, restoring deforested land, degraded land, and so on. So the Systems Change Lab measures progress against 2030 and 2050 science-based targets, as well as enablers and barriers to change. Launched at the end of last year, Systems Change Lab has developed a new open source data platform. Our ambition is that this should serve as a situation room, if you like, to showcase research, interactive dashboards, and data visualizations. So, Paul, taking your invitation to frame some of our conversation, I want to next turn to some of the shifts that we need to see in the finance system. So Systems Change Lab has identified 6 major shifts that are needed to transform the finance system. They're on the screen. I won't read all these out. But again, just to underline that these changes cannot happen in isolation. Global leaders from governments, financial institutions, corporations need to stop investing in assets that emit greenhouse gases and harm nature. To meet key climate and biodiversity goals, we know that we will need around $5 trillion of capital every year by 2050. These investments are necessary to unlock new low carbon technologies, replace existing capital stock, transform business models with alternatives that are sustainable. In these changes, it is imperative that the needs of historically marginalized communities are addressed so that they're able to envisage and indeed realize a more prosperous future. Transforming the system will take fundamental reimagining of the roles that both the public and private sector must play, and a new global financial pact where developing countries have the resources and financial flexibility necessary to develop their economies sustainably. The Summit for a New Global Financial Pact, the meeting that's being hosted by President Macron next week in Paris, centering around the Bridgetown agenda that I'm sure Avi will talk about, will push for systemic change and reforming the global financial system. So looking at our targets, how close are we to meeting the financial targets that we set ourselves for 2030? The latest data from the Systems Change Lab data platform shows that only one indicator is currently on track to meet the 2030 goals. Another 14 indicators are heading in the right direction, but not at the pace we need. So for example, public and private climate finance reached $665 billion in 2020, still way short of what's needed. In the same year, developed countries provided $83 billion in climate finance to developing countries, again short of the $100 billion commitment that's been around for some time. And only about 23% of global GHG emissions are covered by a direct carbon price. To complete coverage by 2030, with at least some level of carbon pricing, coverage needs to grow at nearly 3 times the historical rate. There are some signs of momentum. So for example, 36 countries have implemented or are planning to introduce mandatory regulations for climate risk disclosures. 72 countries have national financial inclusion strategies. Investors are aligning their investment allocations. There's some $7.5 trillion in assets that are now managed in line with net zero targets. More than 1,300 corporations have adopted validated science-based targets, and that number keeps growing. And of course, in the US, we have the IRA, and indeed others are looking to emulate that to steer markets in new directions that favor decarbonization. But despite these signs of progress and momentum, there are still huge barriers. Almost 60% of the poorest countries are at a high risk of debt distress. And these, of course, are the very same countries that bear the brunt of the climate crisis. Net zero commitments from the corporate sector are being criticized for being too vague, not going fast enough, being counterproductive in some cases. The credibility of countries' commitments are in question. And of course, that famous $100 billion commitment. Are we on track? Will it be met? Will finance flow in equitable and just ways? And of course, there's the question of loss and damage funding that surfaced that reached some form of agreement at last year's COP, and where there are high expectations for this next COP. So Systems Change Lab is looking at 5 categories of factors that enable or impede change. And I'm sure we'll touch on many of these as our discussion gets going. But again, just to underline that a systemic approach is needed to create truly transformational change. There is no one solution. We need to see a change in economic incentives, regulations and laws, shifts in behavior, innovation, and of course, unwavering leadership. So these challenges highlight the need for three breakthroughs that can unleash more and better investments to tackle the climate crisis facing people around the world. First, the connection between climate and development goals. We need to bring these worlds together. Second, how corporations and financial institutions respond to policy changes. We need a huge increase in the pace and credibility of their action. And third, the role of climate diplomacy to empower developing countries. We need a huge increase in the scale of resources that are available and a major consolidation in the fragmented landscape of climate finance so that the people who need the money can actually get it. So Paul, I'm looking forward to the conversation ahead. And indeed, I'm hoping and praying for growing momentum this year to address this vital set of issues. Back to you.
Thank you very much. That was an amazing overview and launches us perfectly into a real rock star panel, which I am so thrilled to introduce now. So I don't think we could have really assembled a more knowledgeable and dynamic group of people. At this moment, we're trying to tip the financial system into alignment with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So let me introduce our panelists. Avinash Prasad is the Special Envoy to the Prime Minister of Barbados on investment and financial services and for climate finance. And he is also Emeritus Professor of Gresham College in the UK. Avi was chairman of Intelligence Capital, a company specializing in analyzing, managing, and creating financial liquidity and investment projects and portfolios, and was the non-exec chairman of London-based Elara Capital, an investment bank. Most importantly for this conversation, Avi has been one of the key architects of the Bridgetown Agenda, the group of reforms to the international financial system championed by Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley and others to overhaul the way international public finance supports the intertwined development and climate agendas. The ideas that Avi and colleagues have championed will get maybe their brightest moment in the sun next week at the Paris Summit, and we're thrilled to get his firsthand perspective on how re-engineering public finance mechanisms could drive true systems change. Rachel Kite really needs no introduction as one of the world's most respected thinkers and voices on climate and development. She's currently the Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University, a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level advisory group on climate action, and an advisor to the UK government. She is co-chair of the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative and also chair of the Rwanda Green Fund. Rachel can help us make sense of this moment from the perspective of diplomacy, with an unusual concentration of multilateral moments in the second half of this year related to climate, the SDGs, the Bretton Woods institutions. What will come out of it? So we will get into that. And last but certainly not least, Catherine McKenna is Canada's former Minister of Environment and Climate Change, as well as Minister of Infrastructure. She is the principal of Climate and Nature Solutions and is the chair of the UN expert group on net zero pledges of businesses, financial institutions, cities, and regions, the beautifully named H-LEG. She's also a distinguished visiting fellow at Columbia University and founded Women Leading on Climate. So Catherine, in this context, has the unenviable task of considering the question of how non-state actors, in particular companies and financial institutions that drive the financial system, can integrate and demonstrate climate ambition in their commercial activities. So we'll discuss the prospect for using net zero transition plans as the private sector equivalent of NDCs and other things. So at the end of this, I'm going to pose a few questions to the panelists, and then at the end, we're going to leave time to answer questions from the audience. If you have a question, please feel free to ask using the Q&A feature, and we'll do our best to get as many questions as possible. All right, Avi, we're going to start with you. So can you, as again, one of the architects of the Bridgetown initiative, can you tell us why it's important from your perspective, as we think about systems change for climate and finance, why it's important to bring together the climate and development conversations, and what is the Bridgetown 2.0 that will center the discussion next week at the Paris Summit? What are the key pillars of the agenda?
And let me try to do that, or fairly briefly, because we've got a great set of panelists. I want to hear what they have to say. Look, as Moz was describing this, this sort of global perspective, it occurred to me that one of the challenges we have is the problem for the developed world and the developing world is climate. In the developed world, the main issue is climate mitigation. And around 81% of climate mitigation is being funded by the private sector. So someone in the developed world may think, what is the problem with all this finance? You go into the developing world, though, and first you have a major loss and damage problem. The IPCC says that between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, where 40% of the world lives, where most of the developing countries are, where some of the poorest countries are, they're facing 4 times greater loss and damage than elsewhere. That's a $100 billion a year problem that the developed countries don't have. How do you fund that? Loss and damage can only be funded by grants. You can't have to, if you have to pay it back every time you get hit by a hurricane or a drought, you're going to be sunk under oceans of debt. And where's that $100 billion going to come from? We argue that has to be international revenue raising issues. And we've got to keep it as small as possible because no one wants high taxes. The second problem is adaptation. You don't have that major problem in the developed world, but when you've got 4 times the loss and damage between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, you've got to make your country more resilient, more adaptive. But this kind of loss and damage is an uninsurable event. Climate change is an uninsurable event. We can only deal with it by becoming more resilient. So we're going to get the funding for that. There's no revenues attached to most of the resilience and adaptation agenda. Building a new seawall does not generate revenues. So we need to have massively increase the multilateral development bank lending in order to fund and bring forward resilience today to make those countries more resilient. That's not in the developed world. And then finally, mitigation. The developing world needs to do mitigation. 63% of all the emissions are now coming from the developing world, but only 14% of that mitigation is being funded by the private sector. 81% in the rich world, 14% in the poor world. Why is that? Cost of capital far too high. And what is that cost of capital? It's not actually project risks. It's not sector risks. It's macro risks. It's foreign exchange risk. It's country risk. South Africa borrows at 11% per year. Germany borrows at 1% per year. That's the cost of capital difference we're dealing with. And so we need some kind of FX guarantee mechanism that reduces the cost of that macro risk to really unblock the flow of capital into developing countries to do the green transition. So that, in a nutshell, is Bridgetown. It's an FX guarantee mechanism to unblock the flow of private sector money into mitigation. It's a massive scaling up, 3 times the amount of lending of the multilateral development banks focused on resilience and adaptation, not mitigation, not loss and damage. And then finally, it's the final bit, the hardest to finance bit, loss and damage, for which we need new revenue streams, like the one being discussed at the IMO today in July, on a $100 per ton of carbon emissions tax for the shipping industry. Add that to something on aviation, something on the financial sector, and you have enough money for loss and damage. Thank you.
Thank you, Avi. So tell us, what decisions do you think need to be made this year in furtherance of this agenda, very specifically? And what do you think is going to happen next week in advance that?
You know, I think that to get us from being unstuck is to get us onto a different roadmap. So we were stuck when people are focused on some kind of technological miracle that will solve our problem, some kind of financial innovation miracle that will solve our problem, that the voluntary carbon credit scheme will go from being basically nothing today to something that will solve our problem, or that we could somehow use the insurance capital of the insurance industry to solve our problem. None of those things are going to work. Green bonds, debt swaps, we've done them all as a government country. Their capacity for them to move the needle is limited. So what we really need is a proper roadmap. A roadmap about unblocking the flow of private capital because it deals with the macro risk, massively scales up public development bank lending for resilience, and finds new innovative ways for finance for loss and damage. Even if we don't settle on exactly how we do each of those three things, having that roadmap at least starts us along the right way, in the right direction. And Paul, we've already started. We saw a little bit at the spring meetings, the MDB lending, the World Bank lending going up from $30 to $35 billion a year. We've seen a lot of emphasis around things like climate resilient disaster clauses, something that we've pioneered. We're the largest issuer of those in Barbados to make the system more shock absorbing. We've seen much more momentum on issues of raising revenues for loss and damage. And so there's some movement, but we've got a long way to go. But I would say I would be happy if we got the right roadmap and start to fill in the destinations on that roadmap over the next 18 months. But moving towards the right roadmap, we're almost there, not fully there. That would be a big thing. And I think that's what Paris is about. I think Paris puts us on the right roadmap.
Thank you. Rachel, hello. What to accomplish in the next 12 to 18 months? What do you think are a couple things that would be the most impactful but face some barriers? What would you, in other words, what would you regard as the, not just the desirable pieces, but the barriers to getting them accomplished?
Well, so it's very funny. It really, I'm sort of getting a lot of incoming sort of calls from journalists, over the last few days about the Macron summit. And the first thing I do is remind them that actually it's the Motley Macron summit, that we wouldn't be having this summit if it wasn't for the fact that President Macron, and good on him, but he threw his arms around that initiative formally at COP27. And so I think what the Bridgetown Initiative has done is both in the detail of what Avi just went through, there are a number of very concrete proposals buried in it that are being refined and refined, but it kind of blew the roof off. Or took the lid off Pandora's box, which is, we can't imagine that countries are going to be able to manage a transition to net zero if they're not able to manage the responsibilities to their people and to be able to operate in a system which, basically, is structurally unfair. And I think what Mia Motley and those who've embraced the agenda and have pushed it forward have been able to do is at least open up a window whereby there is a possibility of enough reasonable people in enough places actually working on a fusion of dealing with the sort of debt crisis and dealing with crisis putting on that system as well. So this manifests itself in many places, and I think Abby's right. From Paris is that it gives momentum to and puts us on the right path for a number of things that can be delivered in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. I've just come off a webinar with the G20 Sherpa in India with a number of Indian businessmen. And for India and for many other countries, right, the system, it does not reflect the world as it is today. It doesn't reflect where the capital is in the world today. It doesn't reflect where the investment needs are in the world today, and it doesn't reflect the sort of multipolarity or the multi-aligned world that we have today. So in the long run, the system's going to have to be reworked, but nobody wants to waste a decade of climate action or of debt relief because we're arguing about whether or not the US can dilute its shares with China. So that's there. But then what can we do in the medium and the long and the short term to actually do some of the things that we know how to do? And how do we make the system that exists work more efficiently and more effectively for those goals? And I think that's where Bridgetown's also had an impact. So can we create mechanisms inside the MDB system, for example, and these might be windows or special purpose vehicles or whatever, where different capital can go in without upsetting the balance of ownership, right? Can we, and I think this is where there's more interest, is establish things offshore the traditional international financial system with other forms of capital and with an ability to mobilize private capital that then the system has to go to in order to get access to capital that means that it will be able to do more aggressive things and more assertive things. And we see all of this in formation at the moment, or drafts of this coming out of the COP28 presidency, coming out of other working groups that are working. I'm part of a G20 expert group on MDB reform, and we're looking at all of these ideas. So in the short term, guarantees, can we 5x MEGA and make it green? Can we put credit enhancement mechanisms quickly into place in a number of places? Can we strengthen good old merchant banking? Can we solve credit and currency risk issues? Can we establish other kinds of guarantee mechanisms or embolden the ones that we have to go further? In the medium term, can we realign the incentives within the MDB system so that they are mobile, they're incentivized for impact and incentivized for risk taking in an appropriate way, and incentivized to mobilize their resources for distribution to other forms of capital, rather than sort of getting points for taking a project to the board and taking 7 years to disperse it. And and I'm sort of being a little broad brushstrokes there, but I think these are this is the pushback that you're seeing, and you will hear that pushback, I think, also very much at the Africa Climate Summit at the beginning of September. So I think Avi's right, it put us in the right direction. And then I think there's a number of processes now in terms of reform of existing systems, creating things outside of those systems that make those systems more effective, and then working on the sort of the synapses that are missing in the financial value chain that mean it's not as easy as people think it should be to use public money to leverage private money into the places where it's needed. I actually think that we've got, maybe between now and the 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods institutions in June of next year, to make some good trouble.
Great. And let me just ask you one more thing, and Catherine, then I'm going to come to you. So what, actually a two-parter is, this is a massive jet reform agenda that you guys have laid out, and legislational barrier or two. What do you think will make or break the ability to get this done, considering how much momentum there is behind this agenda? That's one question. And then I'd like, if you don't mind, to turn to the climate diplomacy world, which often seems totally disconnected in my experience from other things like development, private sector, right? In the context of the UNFCCC, where I've served as a negotiator in the past for the United States, the discussion is still about the 100 billion and whether to extend the 100 billion, which is really a political north-south commitment. What do you make of the conversation in the UNFCCC on this? If you could reboot the UNFCCC conversation about climate finance, what would you make it about? So those are the two pieces.
Okay, two very discreet and very precise, small questions. So politically, I mean, I think that we have to manage the tension between, the righteous indignation of many countries that we, haven't mobilized the money that we wasted the last 20 to 30 years since the beginning of the convention, but also 20 to 30 years of a low interest rate environment. And we haven't invested in our own, improved infrastructure in the developed world, and we didn't invest in infrastructure in the developing world at scale, right? And there's plenty of people who could be really righteously indignant and just let that get in the way of the fact that there are ways now, because we are all in the same boat and we are all sort of on the same planet, that you could identify new forms of capital, new sources of capital, new sources of finance, that those financial opportunities exist to be able to do good things that would benefit your own country and benefit other countries. And yes, Should it be the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada because they are, per capita historically the greatest polluters that should be paying? Yes. But if you see a golden opportunity, why wouldn't you take it yourself? So I think we have to manage that tension. And you saw that earlier this week at the Security Council debate on climate, where I think former Secretary Kerry Special Envoy Kerry made a perfectly reasonable speech on behalf of the United States, didn't say anything new, but didn't provoke anybody. And China came in with a very provocative set of arguments that actually the failure to provide climate finance imperils peace and stability, and it therefore is a security issue. I'm not sure that the American diplomats saw that coming. So score one for China, but does that actually help mobilize the finance? So I think we have to be able to hold different debates and have that political debate, but have it not get in the way of some short-term, medium-term, real opportunities which would benefit everybody. Institutionally, I think the multilateral system requires, and we have an opportunity now with new leadership at the World Bank, but they need to be, their KPIs need to be changed. And I think that there's no reason to believe that couldn't happen. And then the system needs to radically collaborate. This has to work better if you are sort of a country trying to access the system. And that brings me then into the UNFCCC. And look, the 100 billion I think is going to be reached. But what's where everybody's putting their energy in is like, can we get 100 billion of the SDRs into a climate adaptation fund for the Africa Development Bank? That would be a very good thing. And I think if climate negotiators are going to sort of stand on ceremony around, the UN's ability to manage all of these different funds, we're just not going to get to scale. So I think that, whereas people can point at the World Bank because it's dominated by the US and sort of say that this institution is not where we want, I think the regional development banks are owned by the regions in a much more useful way. And I think that there needs to be a recognition in the UN sort of finance negotiations that we're in a sort of different world now in terms of where the capital's come from, how it's going to be mobilized, and how it is going to be used. Where the UN has to play a role, and this is my segue to you and Catherine, is in describing what accountability must look like for governments in a more effective way than perhaps it's been able to do up to now, but then also for non-state actors, if we're reliant upon both private and public capital to get to where we need to go.
Thank you, Rachel. Thanks for agreeing to take those on, those little questions. Catherine, so great that you're with us, and would welcome any observations you have on what we've already discussed related to Bridgetown and the network of reforms that's being contemplated to the IFI system. But we'd love to hear about your experience chairing this H-leg.
Never call it that.
Never. What do you want me to call it?
Net zero report.
You want me to say the full? Okay. Well,
no, just say net zero report. Just don't say H-leg.
Net zero report. Net zero report.
H-leg is in the lingerie section of Marks and Spencer's.
That's why we have Rachel here for comic relief, more like and the content.
I'm glad we got the word lingerie into this webinar. Thank you. So can you explain that even the sort of theory that about the UN's role in setting standards on state actors? Non-state actors is a kind of a funny phrase. I mean, I used to be in the financial sector at BlackRock and other places, and it's funny for the governments to group everything that is not a government into one bucket and call it non-state actors, right? But can you explain a little bit about the theory of the case for how the UN setting standards that will shape things like financial flows, the net zero targets of financial institutions and corporates? What was the theory of the case, and what did you discover on this journey of writing this report, first of all, and then we'll get into some other things.
Okay, just to disrupt things, I'm going to go back because I want to tell a story. So I was in, it relates to both what Avi and Rachel were talking about. So I was in Singapore last week at Ecosparity's Net Zero Week conference. And I was on the stage with Bapak Luhut. So he's the Indonesian minister, very well known. And he actually put up a slide. We've had a number of slides, but he put up one slide and he was like, okay, you guys, we are saying we're going to get off coal. That's pretty big. And I will say that as a minister where we phased out coal, and that's hard. Politically, it's very hard because everyone thinks job losses. And so he said, we're going to do this, but someone has to help us pay for it. And then his chart was literally who are per capita the largest emitters historically. Of course, I'm horrified to see Canada number one, but I mean, then it goes US, Australia, Japan. And I think that's kind of the point. I mean, we can go into all the different levers, private, public, whatever, but the reality is we got to do big things and everything is scale. And if we can't get the world off coal, then like all bets are off. But of course, we have to do many, many other things. But I mean, the good news is we know how to do it. And there's gobs of money. I always hear how much money. Everyone's always telling me how much money there is, but we cannot seem to get our act together. So I think that's really the point. Like we all need to be figuring this out together, and we're gonna have to dig really deep because everyone's stuck in their own ways. And a bit like you talk about, you know, the UN talks about non-state actors when they mean like businesses, corporates, financial institutions, and then they throw in cities and regions, which also makes it kind of an unwieldy group. And then you have you know, the financial sector saying like de-risk and, you know, our money's only going to flow if we get this great rate of return. I know that I'm being a little bit pointed, but, you know, I just think like, and then we don't have projects, but, you know, we expect these countries that may not have the capacity to figure it all out themselves. Then we have the MDBs and they're wanting a high rate of return. So then they're competing with the private sector. And I was just like, I've sat in these conversations. I'm like, okay, everyone stop. Everyone just focus on the thing. Don't tell us our problems. Just dig deeper and find a solution. And that's Mia Motley. And as Rachel, I love that she pointed out, it's actually the Motley Macro Summit. So, okay, so that's my backdrop on like, we got to keep it real here. So what is this net zero HLAG terrible name report? I mean, the thing is, it's intended to bring some discipline to an area that's been a free-for-all. Like, okay, so good news, 90% of GDP is covered by net zero commitments. But a lot of folks, like probably most state and non-state entities are really not there. Now, and I'm focused on the non-state entities, but I will speak up for governments. Governments need to dig down and dig deep and do a lot more. That includes the Canadian government. If we don't deal with emissions from the oil sands, we're not going to meet our commitments. So it is fair for the private sector to say, why are you picking on us when governments need to be doing the work too? I accept that. But the whole reason we had the high-level expert group was really to provide discipline to cities and regions, yes, but largely financial institutions and corporates, large ones, multinational ones. It's everyone, but I mean, we got to start with scale and the ones that have capacity to actually provide rigor around what they've committed to doing. It's not enough to say, oh, I'm going to be net zero by 2050. Like as my son says, well, you're going to be dead, Mom, by then. So I don't really care what you're saying about 2050. Now, I hope I'm not dead by then. But the reality is the incentives aren't there when you have, you know, you have CEOs that are around for, I don't know what the average CEO, maybe 5 years. And so it's intended to just do like, you know, be very clear. And is it hard? Yes, but hard things are hard and nothing is harder than climate. But we were very clear what you need to do, what you can't do. So don't talk about 2050 without having interim targets. Ideally 2025, but we're getting very close, 2030, 2035, have transition plans aligned with the targets. And by the way, the targets have to be set at 1.5 with a pathway, science-based, because we just have to do the work. And I tell people, because people say, well, that's unrealistic and it's very hard and we're going to miss things. Well, I'll just put it in swimming terms. So I was a competitive swimmer. I didn't want to be a politician when I grew up. I wanted to be an Olympian. And we had a long-term goal. I was like 13 and I'm like, I'm going to the Olympics. Do you think the times I was doing that had any bearing on what I needed to do? No, I had to have a stretch goal. And people could have said, well, that's really, you're never going to make that. And guess what? That would have been very unhelpful and it wouldn't have helped me make it. Instead, I just dug deep. And, you know, you have to have these interim targets and you have to measure them. And the good thing about net zero is actually measurable. Emissions go down now, money goes to clean at scale now, like this. And so when people say, well, I don't really know, and it's very confusing, I'm like, it's not actually confusing. It may be hard. It may be that you don't want to do this, but it's actually very measurable. And so I mean, really, that's what the deal was. It was to set all of these out. And by the way, I didn't make the Olympics, in case anyone's caring, and people are saying I'm a liar or something. I did make Olympic trials. I did go way faster than I expected, and like no regrets. So that's what we want. We want no regrets, dig deep, innovate, course correct, do all of that, but don't sit on the couch and eat bonbons and then expect that we're going to tackle climate change. But how does this all relate to the broader conversation on financing? I mean, look, without discipline, we're not going to get there. Of course, we're seeing every amazing numbers. Now, I live in my own Twitter bubble like everyone else, but, you know, all my Twitter is filled with all these amazing stats. You know, more than half the new vehicles sold in China by 2026 will be electric. It's going to be a third of those globally, 42% in Europe. It took 20 years to install the first terawatt of solar energy. Next two will be done in 5 years. I could go on. But you also need to have discipline, because it's not just on the, you know, the supply side of renewables. It's on the incentives for folks to stop investing in fossil fuels, but also to support the trillions of dollars. I think it's 1 trillion or 3 trillion if we bring SDGs in for every year when we're trying to get off. We're trying to move to clean energy and also to meet people's basic needs. And that was very clear in our report. So the expert group was experts from around the world. It was the most diverse group. I would like to think that almost the most diverse I've ever been part of. And I mean, people are pretty frank. If you want folks to get to net zero in developing countries, the money is going to have to flow. And we need to figure that out. So I'm not even sure if I've answered your question now, because I've just gone slightly on a rant, but I think that the reality is, I mean, I think there's a lot of smart people, Avi, Rachel, of course, Mia Motley leading the way in the Bridgetown Initiative. But everyone has got to be part of this. And transformational change requires transformations. And it doesn't require like doing little things and little bits and hoping if we all kind of do the same thing, but just a tiny bit differently, we're going to get massive outcomes. And so I think there's huge opportunities. I think there's a lot of momentum, but I never take anything for a given in the climate space, other than women will lead on climate. That's one thing I've seen, but I think I think there's a lot of work to do. I think some good progress, but I think that there's some real challenges, including this COP.
Okay, fantastic. So now we have a lot of pieces on the table, and let me just take a step and look at them. So I've had the privilege of working on finance, climate finance, from both the public sector and the private investment perspective. And I think one thing you highlighted, right, is there is not a common language here or common perspective between the way that the corporates, right, emitters, companies that run carbon intensive businesses, financial institutions, and governments talk about even the language, right? So governments will talk about the private sector as if it is a creature you have to lure out of a cave to do some work, right? And on the other hand, the public sector can be quite skeptical of anything the private sector is trying to do as just a voluntary thing where everybody's always trying to get out of what they should be doing. So we have to transcend all of that. We've talked about the need to mobilize more money to flow into investments that are necessary in particularly in emerging markets, not just for mitigation, but for resilience and for loss and damage. That's causing more money to flow. We've talked about, I think in the financial sector, the language has shifted a little bit from mobilization of money to alignment, right? Alignment to net zero pathways, which is what your group focused on, right? Which is identify your transition plan. So I just want to focus on the mechanics a little bit. Identify write a transition plan that describes how your business strategy will evolve such that your share of emissions is declining in line with what the science says that your sector and your geography and by extension your company should be doing, and make sure that that kind of guidance that you guys developed applies to a pretty wide range of actors, again, from states and cities to businesses and financial institutions. Catherine, what is the biggest disconnect that you've seen in someone who's worked in government but then applied yourself to this question between the way that the financial sector thinks about this and the way that governments think?
I mean, that's a really big question. It's actually a really great question. I mean, often the incentives aren't aligned. Because when I hear folks say, well, it's my fiduciary obligation to make money, so I have to continue investing in fossil fuels. And then, we know that the science says no new fossil fuel infrastructure. I mean, obviously, there's a disconnect there. I'm also a little bit dig deeper. I'm a lawyer too. But, and then on the government side, they say, well, do more faster. And then they're not delivering on their own promises that actually create the enabling environment for folks to do the right thing, whether that's regulating net zero pledges and transition plans and disclosure, which actually the private sector actors that I work with, like the high ambition folks, they want that, which always seems counterintuitive. Folks are like, why would they want regulation? Because there's a competitiveness issue, of course. If you're putting up your hand and saying, I'm going to do the right thing and I'm going to do all this work, the last thing you want are a bunch of free riders. But I think from everyone's vantage point, I mean, I think regulations would really help. But beyond that, I mean, we really do need governments to understand the motivations of the private sector, but also to be working with them. And I'll take one example. When we had to bring in carbon pricing in Canada, that was really hard. Let me tell you, it's not that easy to put a price on pollution. If you do, make it revenue neutral, free advice. But I had environmentalists supporting me, but that was going to get me only so far. So I had to go out and I created a high ambition coalition of businesses and financial institutions. And it's good because you get two financial institutions, two banks in Canada, and then you get all five because the other three have to join, even though they don't really want to. Now, how committed folks are, that becomes a bit of a challenge. And we potentially have seen that with some of these net zero alliances. But that really helps. And that's what when we talk about an ambition loop, as opposed to everyone being in their own bubble, talking different languages, we should just get with the plot. The plot is emissions go down, money goes up to clean at scale. And we have to figure out, okay, what are all hands on deck? What are the levers we need to do that? One thing that does need to happen is and our report was clear on this, you cannot lobby against climate action. Like government regulation or government policies that you can talk about what would make them more effective, fine, but you can't lobby against them and say you're a climate leader. And in fact, you should be lobbying for policies that will enable you to meet your net zero commitments. And so, I mean, that's the positive space I think it's really important to get into. But I'm a realist. I mean, ultimately, we will need to regulate. And we will need governments to actually deliver and not be inconsistent. So providing subsidies of fossil fuels is completely bonkers. One, it's a risk to your own economy. And I say this here in Canada a lot, like the betting on oil and gas forever is not really a strategy. But especially when the fossil fuel companies aren't investing in clean themselves. I was just talking to a colleague that you all would all know, but we were going back and forth on the ratio of investment in clean by fossils. I think it's the ratio is 0.3 to 1. So they're like net zero. They already told us they're like all committed to net zero, but all their money is going to, well, share buybacks and fossil fuels. But the world is 1-to-1 to clean. And so, I mean, I think that we have to translate this in a way that makes sense, sure, but everyone just needs to realize, like, we just have to do more. We have to reduce emissions. We have to put money to clean, and we need to do it in an accountable way. It's not like, what is it? Hope's not a strategy, or a net zero pledge and a nice ad is not actually a plan. That you need to do the work. But I really think governments really need to figure out how to work with the financial institutions and the corporates, but create the right incentives, but they need to support government on good policy. And the last thing I'll say, because people might be wondering about this, and I apologize, I do have to leave at 11:30. So for all those people, I see there's like a bazillion questions. They all look really great. One thing I will say about antitrust in the US, that's been an example of how, antitrust has been used. I'm a reformed antitrust lawyer as well. That's antitrust being used to actually inhibit good climate action. And these voluntary initiatives are nothing to do with cartels or group boycotts. In fact, you need to have industries come together to actually understand, okay, what are standards? What are best practice? What are these things? That's very, very far away. I'm not saying that doesn't cause risk and lawyers don't look at risk, but it is extremely unhelpful. And I think we do need to be clear that actually it's pro-competitive folks working together, especially for consumers, as we need to tackle climate change, but also getting the money flowing. I mean, look what's going on in the US. Massive amounts of money are flowing now to clean, including in red states. So I don't know what the lesson is. I mean, I think the lesson is that everyone has to talk to each other in a way that makes sense, but just be focused on the thing or the two things. As I say, well, there are three things. Money needs to go down. Sorry, money to fossils needs to move to clean at scale now. We need to be reducing emissions at scale, and doing the hard work now. And then, of course, there needs to be a just transition, beneath it, and money needs to flow to the countries that clearly do not have the resources to invest in the clean energy transition or even to adapt to the impacts of climate change, and they have done the least to cause it. And we're all paying the price. Let me tell you, if you're from Canada, what the wildfires are going on, burned more area, in the last little while than in a huge number of years. And it's having an impact, all across the United States.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm sorry you won't be able to join us for the Q&A portion, but we will take your food for thought and try to answer on your behalf, maybe. Avi and Rachel, let me just turn back to you and on the following topic. So we've talked a lot about the need to scale up flows, green flows, right? But as a friend of mine likes to say, in relation to this agenda, if you're on a diet, you can't just eat the number of salads. You have to count the ice creams. So we do talk about ice creams in the context of fossil fuel subsidies. But we're also not just dealing with flows, we're dealing with stocks. We have an economy today to deal with, and it's phasing out of the fossil economy is a challenge which you could distinguish from the challenge of building the new green economy, right? So I'd like you to address two things that we inherit that we're moving forward with as stocks. One is the asset base of the economy today. We've focused now on coal-fired power plants and the need to retire those early. That is but one example of the trillions and trillions of dollars of long life capital assets that we have on the books, which were designed to be in service for much longer than the science says they should be in service if we're going to be on a trajectory to 1.5 degrees. How do you see this challenge, either from a public finance or a private finance perspective? So that's one thing we're dealing with. And the second thing that we have a stock of is debt. And of course, debt and government indebtedness is a huge part of this conversation now in the context of Bridgetown and MDB reform. And it is also a reality that we have to work with. A lot of climate finance is being provided to developing countries, for example, as debt, even though they're facing a lot of stress on their sovereign debt. So how can we make sure that the financing that's being provided doesn't compound the debt problem and actually addresses the root causes so that climate action doesn't worsen global inequality? So those are the two topics. You're free to choose, but maybe I'll start with Avi. You're on mute.
Those are two really vital questions. And I think when you start drilling down, you get to see how thorny these challenges are. I think what we can do, we've used up 85% of our carbon budget. So we've got a limited amount of carbon budget left, 15%. It's being used up majority every year now by developing countries. So we need that transition to take place in developing countries, but those markets are shallow. What will work in a developed market? So in a developed market, you can use revenue neutral taxes and incentives, and you can get transition. And we should do that more. So high carbon taxes that you have in Canada and Europe are a really good approach to deal with this. In the developing world, you put a high tax and an offsetting incentive, and all that will happen is your GDP will fall. Because the markets are shallow, those costs for transition, transaction costs and transition costs are very expensive. And we're seeing this issue with the jet Ps in South Africa. Making the coal transition means you've got to think about the coal miners and what opportunities will the coal miners have, what opportunities does the coal towns have. And so that's why we need a very different approach. And it links in with your second question, because look, the public sector can't put that all on their books. There's no fiscal space. So that's why we need to package these things together with a good rate of return. And in the mitigation world, that is possible. But we need to reduce this cost of capital, and that's why a vital instrument we talk about is a guarantee, a partial guarantee to reduce this cost of capital, to bring some new money in that's off the balance sheet of governments, because the government balance sheets, there's no space, and the private sector will do it because there's revenues there. But we need to unblock that by reducing this cost. But the private sector cannot do everything. It cannot do adaptation and resilience. Now, these things really have very limited revenues. And now, how do we deal with that? Because you need to borrow for that. You've got savings, but you need to borrow for that, and there's no fiscal space. And that's why we do need some new instruments of very low cost, very long-term borrowing. And that is something we can do. That's something we can achieve. The multilateral development banks need to be lending more and on different terms for that adaptation. The debt issue, in a way, you can reframe all of climate into a debt issue, which is, how do we do this without burdening the levels of debt in developing countries? And we say that a few ways. One is we've got to take things off the balance sheet of developing countries. Developing countries today are funding climate mitigation. We've got to take that off. We've got to the private sector does it in rich countries. We need to get the private sector to do it in poor countries with guarantees. And then the governments are dealing with loss and damage. They are funding loss and damage. 50% of the increase of debt in vulnerable countries, 50%, 50, is dealing with loss and damage. Loss and damage caused by other countries. We've got to take that off their balance sheet. Their balance sheet is going to be fully utilized trying to build resilience in their economy. Resilient people, resilient infrastructure, resilient systems. They're going to have a lot of debt. They're going to have more debt. They can't deal with also the debt of loss and damage. And so that's why we need new instruments. So what we need to do is take the things we can take off their balance sheet. Mitigation we can take off, loss and damage we should take off. And that's why we need these new international revenue streams to take that off their balance sheet, because otherwise these countries really are drowning with too much stuff on their balance sheet and too much debt. There's a very strong nexus between climate and debt and development, and we need to untangle that nexus.
I have to say peace out, but sorry about that. But anyway, thank you. A great discussion. And Avi, thanks to you for your leadership. It's critically important. And I think we all have to just recognize who's paying the price right now. I mean, we're all paying the price, but that we all are in this together, and we need to figure out how we can support countries that are feeling the greatest impact and need the money so that they can transition and adapt. Anyway, thanks very much. Great conversation. Bye.
Thank you, Catherine. Rachel, over to you.
I mean, to try to build on what Abby said, with which I agreed, two things. Three things. First, we're gonna pay for it one way or the other, and we're going to, if you're sitting in a developed country worrying that there's nothing we can do to reduce the cost of capital, which is essential if we're going to be able to invest at scale in the green infrastructure necessary across North Africa and Africa in more general terms, then there is a fix for that. It's about how we understand risk. It's about how we price risk, and then how we build systems around that. So we can bring down the cost of capital. Part of the cost of capital is high because these countries are considered to be risky. Well, they're risky because they don't have good utilities, they don't have regulatory framework in place for smart grids, they don't have X, Y, Z. Well, so we could pay for at low cost or for free, even subsidize all of the institutional support and the technical assistance that's going to be necessary for that, so that any investment in would be priced more favorably because the risk would be considered to be more manageable. Or we don't do that, in which case the money won't flow, and then we will have more displaced people. We will have more opportunity for extremism to prey on the poor. We will have more opportunity for migration. We will have more disasters like the ones we saw in the Mediterranean overnight. So we choose how we pay for this, but we will pay. We have to pay. And I think that's just we should never forget that. Secondly, the ramping up of the green, lots of things we can do, short, medium term, long term. Ramping down of the brown, lots of things we can do, short, medium, long term. Lots of those already on the agenda and being talked about. Where I think we've got more work to do is how you help countries manage the public and private balance of that. So there is a real risk for a number of countries that those brown assets end up on the public balance sheet. Green will, private sector will be induced or incentivized, or will see the opportunity investing in green. They're not going to invest in brown. And despite some of the political headwinds in the developed world, especially in the US around ESG and woke capitalism, people are still voting with their pocketbooks in one direction overall. So how we then ramp down the brown, ramp up the green, and then allow for the public balance sheet to manage those bad assets away from the kind of tax burden that will imply over the long run, I think is really important. There are people now in the IMF and others starting to look at that, but I think there is a really important fiscal and structural problem that has to be addressed. And of course, we know how to do transition economics, and we've done it before. When the Iron Curtain fell, we've done it. We've seen very rapid transitions. Look at Korea after the Asia financial crisis, but we've never had to do it for so many countries at the same time. And so this is where I think the agenda for sort of radical collaboration within the multilateral system exists, because we're going to need all of those balance sheets working much more in concert than they are at the moment. It's not just about getting together and agreeing on the methodology for understanding adaptation finance. This is really about, well, okay, country X has got this plan for its transition. So how does this regional development bank, all of these DFIs, this World Bank, the IMF, and then the private sector, how does it all come together in order to support that to happen? And we're starting to see windows of those kinds of platforms through the JETPs, etc. But they're the first generation. They're pretty clunky. I think the debt to equity ratios might be, pushing the edges of reality in some cases. So there's a design issue there about how we come together. But managing the phase out and the phase in at the same time, I think poses some fairly significant issues for the public balance sheets of many countries. And then I think when it comes to debt, Avi said it all, but the disciplining and the sobering factor here for the developed world that might not want to resolve debt quickly is that we will end up paying a much higher price if we don't.
There are a couple of things I'd like to pick up on. We've been talking, Paul, about a lot of challenges. That one can almost feel the weight of the challenges. But as Rachel was speaking, it occurred to me she's also talking about huge opportunities. We're talking about a massive upscaling of investment. Investment leads to growth. Investment is the way we get growth. And so we can do this in a coordinated way that leads to massive global growth, and we need to do it in that way. I think the other fascinating thing that in thinking a lot about cost of capital recently, we discovered something that is really very counter to what most people think. When you say to people that the cost of capital in developing countries is high, they think it's all the problems to do with the project. all the problems to do with the sector. They think, well, you haven't got your regulation right. You haven't got your enforcement of contracts right. You haven't got your fiscal incentives right. But there's now a tremendous amount of data on this cost of capital, and it's telling us something very unusual. So when you look at the cost of capital of a solar farm in South Africa, it's around 14%. Now we can break down that cost of capital between the country risk, and which doesn't include all the very specific things to do with that project. It's about lending to the government, and then the additional risk, which is lending to the project. And when you do that, you find that the project risks and sector risks in developing countries are almost the same as in developed countries, which is a fascinating result. Now, why is that? It's partly because developing countries trying their best to bring these projects, give them loads of incentives, loads of subsidies. And you know, I'm my country's chief negotiator when foreign investors come. They walk if I don't give them long-term guarantees, these private investors. They walk if I don't tell them that if there's a dispute, they can go to an international court. They walk if I don't agree that if there's a policy change, there's some compensation. When Germany and Spain moved from feed-in tariffs to auctions and changed the system, and Europe changes its carbon taxes and its fiscal regime, it doesn't have to pay compensation to investors. So in fact, the regulatory regime is very uncertain in the developed world. It's as uncertain, all the different kinds of risks, than in the developing world. So the scope for us to reduce project risk and sector risks in the developing world is actually much less than people realize. The real scope we have to deal with is country risk, and that's what's really blocking this capital. And as Rachel said, there are ways of dealing with that. There are ways of solving that, because we know with a long history that the risk premiums the markets demand are twice the size of what they should be. And so we can reduce those risks and unblock that capital.
Thank you. That's a really important point, that it's really sovereign risk that's the issue. It's not necessarily a technology risk or things that are specific. And when you focus, you can't wag the sovereign risk dog with the tail of climate policy. Okay, great. You know, we've this point about phasing down and phasing up, for those who might be newer to this conversation, is a very important point, and one that I would say did not receive enough attention until recently, when because people are so green. My own sort of way of thinking about this is, I have a lot of, and private innovation can drive pretty well, no matter what the exact economic system is. Here it is capitalism. It's not that bad at developing the new technologies and figuring out how to finance them if there's revenue associated with them, which there is for, of course, the energy system. The role of government in that story, including on the finance side, is, I would describe as tactical. Right? It's government, which is not to say it's not important, but you know, government needs to support RD&D. Government needs to support deployment, as in the Inflation Reduction Act or Fit for 55. Government needs to deal with permitting, which is a question that's come up in the Q&A. Those are all things that governments do to help unlock and unleash the market forces that we know are good at developing, you know, new technologies. We need to develop them at an inorganic pace, is the challenge we have in this case. The role of governments in driving phase down is more strategic, because it is only governments who can really sort out the allocation of losses, for example, associated with the early closure of facilities or trying to pull ICE vehicles off the road before the end of their lifetime. So when we think about the financial dimensions of this, we're dealing with both the opportunity to create, you know, profits through the green economy and figuring out how to do that on a risk-adjusted basis and how to incentivize capital to flow to EMs. We're also dealing with the question of how you avoid minimize value destruction for investors and workers and communities associated with the phase down. of the economy that we've got today. So let me now start to draw on more explicitly some of the questions in the Q&A in our remaining time. One question that's come up before the event and in a live Q&A is this question about, is the role of the private sector and private finance really, should we think of it as limited to mitigation? How do you both see the potential role of private finance in resilience and adaptation, even loss and damage? Is this something we should view as a government cost or something we should view as an opportunity? Spoiler alert, a lot of people think the latter, but eager to hear your views, at least for resilience.
Well, let me give you the experience of a government. So every 6 months, one of the major development banks come to us and say, we can get the private sector to help you fund your resilience and adaptation. And we say, oh, can you? Because that would be great, because we don't have the money. But we're not sure they can do that because we tried and there's no revenue streams. And they say, no, of course we can do that because, think of your hotels, they say. In 20 years' time, they'll be flooded. And so what we can do now is but they should pay today to build this resilience to stop them from having that cost. And I look at them and I'm thinking, they're probably straight out of graduate school, maybe Chicago. They don't realize that those hotels do not have that liability in their balance sheets. In fact, those hotels are convinced the government has that liability on its balance sheets. And those hotels have no balance sheets. They've managed to make sure there's no space on those balance sheets for any liability like that. So every 6 months, they come and they try and tell us they can do it. And we say, you are welcome. You are welcome to come and spend a week and bring your entire and find me the plan that will get the private sector to fund risk experience. Is that not really? So yes, there's a bit of a fuzzy line. There may be some stuff they can do. The vast majority of resilience and adaptation can be borrowed for, creates a savings, does not have a revenue stream for the private sector. And so, yes, there are some exceptions. But let's be real and be focused. I've got an adaptation bill. 90% of that is going to be public spending. And I've got to find cheap ways of doing it. And I don't know why the private sector should be so bothered about that conclusion. They've got a huge problem to do on mitigation. They haven't got enough money for mitigation. So just concentrate on getting mitigation right, and they'll use up all of their capital just doing that.
Yeah, I would just
follow up. Just a quick follow up, but that's the perspective of the investments that are needed, right, to make the economy resilient. But wouldn't you say that resilience, the business of resilience, is itself a growth industry? Like, who's supplying the technologies, services, and products to governments, households, businesses that need to invest in resilience? And doesn't it matter? Shouldn't we be encouraging innovation?
I was saying to a businessman the other day when they were, in fact, it was an insurance company. I was saying, you guys can't insure this stuff. It's uninsurable. The risks are rising, correlations are rising. But what your investment arm should be doing is investing in resilience because people are going to be spending a lot of money on resilience. And yes, I mean, we do that all the time. Now, resilience doesn't actually necessarily have to be expensive. It can be a lot of innovations. I was involved in trying to rescue Dominica after Maria, and we got into all kinds of interesting practical experiences. And what I learned was, for example, that the most resilient bridge was probably a collapsible bridge that I could collapse before the hurricane came and open it back up again. Trying to make my bridge heavier and heavier and heavier was not only more costly, but wasn't very helpful when, because half a damaged bridge is no good, right? So you have to be completely undamaged or not. So, we're talking about resilient people, resilient systems, as well as resilient things. People need to hugely invest in that. But there's a real business in doing that. I'm not sure why they're not doing enough of that. It doesn't always mean lots more money, but it is expensive as well.
Rachel, sorry to interrupt you.
No. So it's this beautiful thing called a public-private partnership, right? So, if the government sets, if the government sets clear guidelines on, the spec that a road's going to have to be built to, because we now know we're going to have to withstand temperatures of 48, 49 degrees centigrade on a regular basis in the summers, then the private sector is perfectly capable of inventing the road surface that will be able to withstand that kind of heat, right? But there is, when government sort of sets a direction of travel and sets a clarity around where the investable proposition is going to be, then the private sector will come in, and then there are markets for those things. I think the issue that we have with the technologies and the products and the services for a world which has to be more resilient is deploying them quickly, right? And that means deploying them into the places where they're needed the most, and then we come up against the usual problems of investing in emerging markets, etc. I think the other piece of however, is the sort of general, and Catherine talked about this, the sort of the general C- scorecard that you would give to most governments. Most companies need to be completely on top of their transition risk. Now, let's just talk about companies in the developed world, right? You're running significant transition risk in all kinds of sectors of the economy, and yet there is little, if no, regulation around that. And so if you're doing business in, I don't know, the Gulf of Mexico coast of Texas, Louisiana, Florida, or whatever, then you should absolutely know the exact nature of the risks to your capital plant, to your supply chains, and what that means for you. But those numbers are very discreetly hidden from most states' representatives, right? So state government. And you, Paul, in earlier parts of your career, spoke, very eloquently and from a very informed perspective about rolling up all of the numbers of sort of, the calculation of transition risk, company by company, county by county, state by state, and you come up with numbers which are a hell of a lot more alarming than sort of the annual Fast Company story every December that says that extreme weather events cost the United States a couple of $100 billion. So I think that we there's this question of the resilience of companies themselves to what they're going through, how they invest in their ability to be more resilient, the way in which they are regulated, and then the opportunity. And it is extraordinary opportunity because it's everything from heat and drought resistant seeds through to new materials in infrastructure, new materials in building, the extraordinary opportunities for new cooling technologies. I mean, it's all there to be had, right, by the countries and the sectors that are supported and incentivized to win that race to the top.
I'd just like to add to that, though. I think we need. I think we can use in developed countries disclosure requirements and risk assessments, and the accounting system and financial risk management systems to help promote the transition we need. In poor countries, if we try to do that, what's going to happen is people just stay away. Because when they start to actually see the risk, they realize this is a very expensive thing that is not going to be done by other people. So now I'm always in favor of more transparency, the better. But what it means is it's got to now come along with a financing package. Because unless it comes along with a financing package, more transparency on these risks and more disclosure requirements will actually lead to more concentration of private capital rather than the greater dispersal, which is what we're looking for.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic discussion. Thank you, guys. And the only thing I would add is, the cost. There will be a cost to society of adapting to climate change, no question. But that cost is not fixed, and how expensive it is to a large degree, a function of how fast and far we can innovate in providing those products and services to governments and households and companies that need them. And if we can provide them cheaply, if we can provide them better, then
And
the
early.
total price tag, pardon?
And early.
Then the price tag to all of us will be lower, which is why I think, you know, it is useful to focus on the driving the business opportunity for the private sector, even if somebody's got to pay for the air conditioner or the water pump or the wildfire data set at the end of the day. Okay, I have two more that I've collected. I don't know if we're going to get to both of them, but let me just start with one before the top of the hour when we're going to have to wrap. One theme in the questions is that it does indeed seem like we who work on this stuff in the public sector, the financial architecture, financial flows, tend to focus a lot on multilateral institutions. You know, how can we better reform these Washington-based institutions or these regional institutions? And on the one hand, on the other hand, the politics of climate finance in the UNFCCC also have, for different historical reasons, a north-south orientation. But we also, I think, probably would all agree that in the long term, we're not trying to solve this problem by pushing money through a straw from north to south, and we can't decarbonize major and emerging economies by banging at, you know, the World Bank and regional development banks. We are also trying to build homegrown engines of development finance and climate finance. So I'd love both of you to comment on this question of how do we continue to obsess about things like MDB reform and IFI reform and making the GCF better and standing up a new biodiversity fund at the GEF and standing up an L&D fund and focusing on the role of donor governments and multilateral institutions, but also to make sure we're centering a lot of attention on local agency, local, you know, even in financial terms, right? Local banks are kind of better at understanding local risk than someone sitting in Washington, DC flying in. So how do we flip the script a little bit so that we're not just trying to do an endless north-south project here? Rachel, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, so I'm speaking to you from the great state of Massachusetts, where the governor just announced this week another piece of the sort of financial architecture that we need locally, right, which is a sort of a green bank building off what already exists, right? So whether you're talking about Massachusetts or Ghana or Bangladesh or whatever, first of all, we have to mobilize domestic savings to be invested in the things that a country needs, and learn the lessons of how to use a little bit of public money to crowd private investment in where that's possible into the things that we need. Secondly, I think that the reason why we end up talking about the MDB system a lot is that it's a political non-starter, right or wrong. We can have that discussion on another webinar. It's a political non-starter for most of the owners of those institutions to go back to their parliaments and get new cash. But there's a lot of cash sitting there, misdirected, underutilized, underleveraged, and not doing very much. So if we could take that capital stock and deploy it more effectively, more aggressively, and allow it to leverage it. Well, I mean, first of all, instruct it to work a little bit harder and certainly move a lot faster, and then leverage, use it to leverage other and crowd in other financing, then that seems to be like a reasonably smart thing to do. And I think that you can get to through a number of different not politically impossible measures, get to a point where that's close to 500 billion. And then if that 500 billion is then leveraged externally, then you should be able to get up into the trillions that we're talking about needing into emerging markets. Now, I'm not a Pollyanna, anybody who knows me, but there is a pathway to doing this. And so I think that that's a reasonable conversation to have, while we then also look at, you know, all the other trillions of dollars in the global economy that could be marshaled in, you know, offshore the MDB system, offshore the international financial architecture, into new funding mechanisms that might be able to be used directly approached by governments, directly approached by the private sector, or directly approached by even the MDB system to leverage themselves further. And then, of course, we've got things like new financial flows, and Avi mentioned a whole bunch of them. But by putting levies on those who pollute the most, whether that's a business class air traveller or a point-to-point cargo ship or whatever, I think there's extraordinary amounts of funding that can flow. So that's worthwhile, the effort. And then I think we've got this long-term conversation about who owns the financial architecture and what its mission should be. But I think if we squeeze more juice out of what we've already got, and then use that juice to make a new cocktail, I think that's a useful use of our time, particularly this year and next year.
I think we need to stop thinking in terms of North and South. I think that the real split is public versus private. And, we've been trying to shove this into a mitigation adaptation, and it is not completely mapped one for one. But I would say that we need to I don't want the balance sheet of the MDBs to be heavily preoccupied with mitigation, because we need to find catalytic ways of getting the private sector to be doing that, because there are revenues. And that means domestic private sector in developing countries. It means domestic instruments, as well as international instruments that brings the external private sector. The more domestic mobilization, the better, although that is, we're always going to have an external requirement, because what we're asking developing countries is to go at a faster pace than they would normally do themselves. The planet requires them to go at an artificially faster pace. So that means it's going to have some kind of external capital injection. And I would focus that on the private external of mitigation. I think that the adaptation is going to be a largely public sector, and there's going to be a fair bit of government public sector, and as much as possible multilateral development bank public sector, helping to limit the amount of debt. When I go to the marketplace, I borrow at 9%. If I borrow the World Bank, I'm borrowing at 4%. That makes a huge difference to how much resilience and adaptation I can do.
Thank you both. And we are reaching the hour here. So I just want to thank you and to Catherine McKenna and to Moazzam, who set us up at the beginning, for a fantastic discussion. We have covered the issue of flows to mitigation, to support adaptation, loss of damage, the different roles that public and private sector need to play or could play. Avi's emphasis on clearing the decks for public institutions to be able to focus more on resilience and loss and damage. We've also talked, though, a little bit about the opportunities to think about private investment in resilience, or the business of resilience. We've talked about some of the stocks that we're dealing with as we try to ramp up flows, including debt and the potential for stranded assets, and how important dealing with potentially stranded assets is for unlocking the political economy of climate action and political will to move it forward as fast as we can. And we've had a very interesting discussion about who drives this process, the extent to which we should be focused on MDBs, on local institutions, whether we're creating green banks or focusing on mobilizing domestic savings, and of course, the role of the private sector and corporates as they plan their own journey to net zero. So with that, I thank you, and I thank the audience who attended today and submitted so many thought-provoking questions. We will send along a link to the recording from today's session via email within the next few days. And of course, just as a reminder of next week's important event, the Motley-Macron Summit in Paris, where many of these issues will be debated. Finally, please be sure to check out the Systems Change Lab data platform. There's a note and a link in the chat right now, and tune in for future events from the Systems Change Lab. With that, thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.